like, what is, I know Sunoco is, oil, right, gasoline, but, and these billionaires, it's the profit, like, I know the profit is the money, right? But do they not understand too that eventually, we all gotta breathe air, right? So, unless they go to Mars or whatever, they gonna die too, or be sick, right? So that's my question, like, we all are collateral damage based on capitalism and, you know, all the things, so we keep on this trajectory, how much time do we really got, like, as humans? Like, what is the real result? Like, what is it?
Well, the result that I think everybody's looking for is to have clean air and a healthy environment for everyone. So we don't want anyone to be collateral damage. Part of the way in which that is accomplished with programs of the EPA, and I want to speak for them, they're here to speak for themselves, is to assure that conditions are safe, and when they're not, to get them cleaned up. And part of that is the involvement that we have as a community is through what is referred to as the public involvement spectrum, which is in the handout. You can take a look at the way in which that's designed. The EPA uses that, and so does the DEP. What's happened is a lot of the way in which the communication has taken place has been where public officials provide information to the community. But that's not the same thing as being in a consultative relationship, where there's a conversation back and forth. We're hoping is to move that spectrum to the right so that there's more communication between people and public officials. That's what we're trying to get started today. Yes?
Just to kind of jump off of that, like, when you're saying the goal is clean air, clean land, clean water, what does that mean? Because I think, like, right, we're kind of learning about this history that's 150 years of different forms of pollution affecting all of these land systems. So, I guess, like, kind of coming as like a new person into this, could you kind of just lay out the groundwork of what has been done in terms of remediation and kind of what, because my understanding of how EPA works is there is like acceptable levels of pollution. So like what are we actually saying when we're saying air to water?
And I want to add too, when I'm saying too, is if we keep not cleaning up, that's my question. What is the result? Like, are we going to have air masks in 20 years? That's what I want to know. What's the repercussions if we don't clean up? That's what that's what I want to know. Is cancer rates going up? Is these scientists, y'all know the things or y'all study the things, will cancer rate go 20 more percent? That's what my question is. I know what you're saying, but I want to know the result if we don't do anything. I really want to know the truth. Like, what's going on?
What do we face? What
are we facing? Like, be for real. Like, you know what I mean?
That's exactly the point. That's what people want to know is, what do we face? What is the future going to be like? What can you tell us about what our future will be?
Start on that, sure. So there's obviously a lot of different issues here in terms of different types of pollution. A lot of the concerns are with the air pollution. The air pollution was bad with the refineries operating, so we have the smokestacks, right? And that's gone, so that's much different today. Kevin and I have a responsibility for overseeing cleanup of what's in the ground. With the soil and groundwater, what could be getting into the Schuylkill River, and potentially what could be getting into the air, although that's sort of a smaller component because it's mostly in the ground. So, I think we're going to be best able to speak to that. That cleanup is being done mostly by Sunoco, which was the company that operated the refinery for a couple decades. They stepped away in 2012, sold it to PES, which then shut it down in 2019. So there's some division of responsibility. Sunoco needs to take care of all the legacy contamination up until 2012. And they're required to clean up that contamination. They have a legal agreement with Pennsylvania that it requires them to do it. Hilco acquired PES. They have the responsibility for the contamination from 2012 on, and there is some contamination there. Generally not as much, not quite as widespread, but there is localized contamination from that several years that PES operated. So Hilco's also entered into cleanup programs with the state for storage tanks, for things like pipeline releases, a few localized areas. And they're obligated to do that cleanup as well. There's different ways of doing cleanups, and we're sort of midway through the process right now. The first step is they need to understand what's there. They need to do what we call characterization. It's like an investigation. So they need to put holes in the ground, collect samples of the soil, collect samples of the groundwater, see how bad it is, see how it's distributed. For the most part, that's been done. They've done a lot of that investigation. EPA, EP, and the different companies have a good understanding of what's going on. The next steps are how to deal with it. You know, how to either clean it up or manage it so people aren't being exposed, which is your concern. So Mr. Quincy, mentioned that you guys don't want the contamination getting trucked through your neighborhoods, and that would certainly be a concern. It's a very big facility, 1,400 acres. It's contaminated throughout. If they tried to remove all that contamination, it would probably take decades. and you're right, it would have to get shipped out somehow, and that would be a problem for the community. The more viable solution that Sunoco is looking at with their contamination is managing it in place. So not trying to remove it all, but leave it there, but ensure that people aren't exposed to it. So there's some different remedies, different ways you can manage your contamination. If it's in the groundwater, you need to make sure nobody's drinking that water. You need to make sure that it's not coming to the surface so people aren't breathing vapors from it. You need to make sure that that polluted groundwater isn't getting into Schuylkill River. So there's different technologies, different rules that can be applied to that property to make sure that people don't have that exposure. If it's soil contamination, it's sort of a similar thing. You can leave it there as long as it's managed. So a very common remedy or solution for that is to cap it, to put something over the surface to ensure that people aren't getting that contaminated dirt, into their mouths, they're not breathing it, they're not being exposed to it. And so that's sort of where Hilco comes in. Hilco is going to be rebuilding the facility. We know that they're going to be putting in buildings, parking lots, roads, pavement, and where there's going to be a landscaped area that can bring in clean soil. So this is sort of the prospective solution. This hasn't really been formally proposed to us yet, but this is what everybody's envisioning as a solution. Yes?
Yes, no, I just wanted to chime in and just to address the concern that these two young ladies, the two young ladies have here. And I think they're very good questions, and it shows forward thinking. What happens if we don't clean up, or if we just leave the contamination there? Where we are as a society is as a result from years and years and years of bad habits, bad practices. And until those habits and those behaviors change, it's only going to get worse. That goes to partially answers the question I believe that you were asking. Then we have to look at things from a policy perspective. We have folks here from Department of Environmental Protection. Is what we're doing, and these are the questions we have to ask ourselves, are the standards that we impose, be it on industry, being it ourselves as consumers and individuals, are we taking enough responsibility, or are we taking enough proactive measures that if we keep things the same, what's going to change? Maybe we need to look at increasing those standards so that we can really tackle this problem. Because this problem, we didn't get here overnight. This is from years of neglect, which many of us have contributed to, because we didn't know back then. But now we have the opportunity to know and to learn, and it's incumbent upon all of us and assuming that the majority of your city residents, you know that the city has recently established what is called an Environmental Justice Advisory Commission. I happen to be one of those commissioners. These are the resources that you need to tap into. And collectively, as a community, and this is word to the wise, we as the Black National Environmental Justice Network are looking for projects that we can take to the White House to be funded to address your concerns. I need each and every one of you to go to your representatives at Philly Thrive, or wherever, whatever community you belong to, and I want you to discuss among yourselves. What would environmental, or what kind of a project can we come up with that will help us to address our environmental concerns? Are they studies? Are they proposed new standards that can be evaluated, studied, analysis conducted, to put forth, to put at the table? Because you not come with facts and figures. You can't come emotional, okay? And then have your representatives from Philly Pride call me. I'll make sure you get some money. But this is where you are. If we do nothing, it will get worse. If we don't change our behaviors, it will get worse. If we don't evaluate things from a policy perspective, and to begin educating not only ourselves, but our elected officials, because you can't hold each person responsible for what they don't know. Maybe you and I have to teach them. But if it's worth preserving lives of this generation and future generations, then it's worth it.
So the refinery shut down 4 years ago. As Russ pointed out, we had this big spike in benzene just last December. What's going on? Are conditions better than they were? How much better? How much better are they now than when we started talking about cleaning up this mess back in 1998? And we've been doing investigations of it since 2003. It's been a long time coming. So what the committee wants to know is, where are we now compared to where we were then? And where will we be a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? What is the pathway to having a safe environment for everybody? Yeah.
The topic of 20 years from now is so important, and it's actually a report that Evergreen and Sunoco have to file. It's called the Fate and Transport Characterization. It was mentioned that most of the characterization reports are done. This one is not. This is the lone characterization report, and it's supposed to say what is going to happen to underground pollution 20, 30, 40 years, even longer from there. And I will say that DEP, EPA, and the Army Corps of Engineers all wrote very thorough, what they call deficiency letters for Evergreen's initial report. I actually have copies of them if people want to talk about it later. But 20, 30 years from now, there is a firm system to keep track of that.
And just for the record, the council doesn't always agree with EPA or DEP on many things, but on this one.
Stand up.
Yeah, I'm just saying for the record, the Cleaner Council sometimes doesn't agree with DEP or EPA on everything, on maybe many things, but on this one, they did address and are asking Evergreen to look at a lot of things that we were asking about, and community groups and residents were asking about. And yeah, I think my understanding is that they're sort of going back to the drawing board in a way, and have to propose a new sort of model. I think it would be good to know sort of what that sort of timing or expectation would look like for Evergreen report.
By the way,
Can I
on
just
page
ask you a
24 of the
question?
handout, there's information about fate and transport.
I just have one question. You mentioned about the clean air monitoring stations. I just want to know, how can you find out where they're located in the community?
The locations are in the handout.
It is in here?
It's on, actually, it's the last page.
All right,
It's
great.
the location of where the monitoring stations are that the city maintains.
Okay.
Two of them are nearby, one at River Street, 24th Street, which is pretty close to where we are now. The other at the airport.
See, I'm in Southwest Philly, so I'm like across the bridge.
This is at the airport, would be the closest to you.
Okay. One more question, real quick. I know that, and I won't be long. I know that you mentioned about the other organization that's coming in and doing work and doing this and that to cover, to smash down, to do whatever. What happens when you start building? Does that not cause that contamination to kind of rise or move when they start impacting and stirring? Right, doesn't that not, or should the community be concerned even about that? When they start the development? Thank you.
Yeah, and that's a really good question. That's obviously the concern. It's to some extent, it's in the ground, been there for decades,
Right.
but now it's going to be disturbed in a way it hasn't for a long time. So it's sort of a bit of a catch-22 because that work has to happen to get a cap built on top, so it'll be basically entombed. But while that work's happening, there have to be precautions taken to be sure that you don't get a lot of dust, you don't get stuff getting blown into the community. So they need to have things like health and safety plans, soil management plans. They need to take measures to ensure that they're controlling dust. The city has primary responsibility for enforcing that, but they're going to be working with DEP on it.
One of the things that I thought about was when there's a loud noise in your neighborhood, they put up brick walls to stop that noise from affecting your house and all of that. Why wouldn't that be not a consideration when they start moving the grounds in that area to kind of help isolate what they're doing? You understand my question?
I do, and I mean, it's a good thought. One thing that helps is this place is so big that when you're working in the middle, you're not gonna get a lot of dust at the edges. So the problem's gonna be maybe when they're working close to the fence, close to the roads, and then you might have to worry a little bit more about stuff getting transported into the community. A key thing that they do for dust control is use water. So they spray the dirt with water, that makes it heavier, it sticks together, it tends to blow around less. So that's going to be an important responsibility for the city and DEP to ensure that that's being done.
Sheila?
Hi, two-part question. One is you're entombing the site, so how is this non-porous surface going to impact island effect? And it's a massive site, so if this is about hardscaping, a lot of it, I don't know how much of it would be covered then again in soil or other surfaces. And secondly, what about the groundwater and how it leaches into the river? And how is that going to be mitigated?
That was one of the big responses, and all of the regulators speak for themselves. That was one of the criticisms of Evergreen's report. They did not test the Schuylkill for contaminants of concern.
They did test Suco for the contamination.
Okay.
So they're not affecting the river itself, any chemical contamination from the site?
Yes?
Hi, my name is Stephanie. I work in community development. So the one suggestion that I would have is, I'm currently doing some work in Southwest Philadelphia. I know Carolyn Mosley pretty well. And the one thing that I've come to realize that I would give you all is access to information, right? I mean, we've been hearing we need a seat at the table often, but I think it's very important to have conversations like this so that number one, people understand what a seat at the table looks like, but also number two, because we sit in a space of like legislation and policy and engagement, we have different terms and knowledge that's just not common knowledge, right? So I think it's important that number one, we reconsider how we're letting the community know what's happening, because a cleanup has already been occurring. I'm aware of that because of my job, not because I live in Southwest Philly, right? So how can we be more effective with the resources that we have for community engagement to get the word out there more? What organizations can you partner with? What websites can you create? How can you readjust your website so that you can have this information readily available? And to everyone else in the crowd, I will give you some insight as well, and to be proactive, right? So a lot of this information is available. People have just, bureaucracy moves really slow. So a lot of these websites, a lot of this information is readily available, but navigating it takes time. So as these organizations are making this information available, look it up, call your representative. It's gonna take work also for you to see change in your neighborhood. So like things like this with Philly Thrive is great, but Philly Thrive cannot host these events every week to keep you all up to date. So take that responsibility as yourselves to keep these organizations accountable, that if you can't find something on their website, if you don't have an update, send an email, give a phone call. You may have to get annoying, but the size of this development is gonna take more than my organization, these organizations to hold each other accountable. So I just wanted to say that.
I think you're right. I think people are interested in the bottom line. Is it safe? How does it affect me? What's going to happen in the future? Big questions, 35,000 big questions. And then, when they have some idea of that, they dig down into the details. Yes?
Hey, my name is Bethany. I work at Penn. I'm a climate change educator, and one of the things that really keeps me up late at night when I think about my friends in South Philly is the way that freight and transport is going to be really affected by storm surge, sea level rise, and really huge rain events. I don't really hear a lot of talk about that in these plans. I maybe missed it, but I would really appreciate hearing from the regulators about how climate change and climate impacts in South and Southwest Philadelphia, where we are really vulnerable, are being factored into these remediation plans.
So I'll jump in with a few things. I think I have a few points to touch on. Hopefully, in the sake of time, I'll try to do it relatively quickly. And if we want to follow up, and Peter says we have more time, everyone wants to stay, please do. So to answer your question, just real quickly, that's more involved in the freight and transport model Russell described. So part of those discussions and part of those thought processes were implemented into that because that is a future-looking model that we're looking at. In addition to that, Hilco's done some work with the areas that are prone to flooding and are focusing more on those areas to elevate them out of those areas where you can actually have flooding impacts. So that's part of the ongoing work with that, in addition to the freight transport for the future looking precipitation events and things like that that might impact contamination potentially moving in the future.
Sorry, but isn't it the case that they're going to hard service it, in which case if they elevate that, the water is going to run into the neighborhood as well as the river?
Well, a lot of the management probably stormwater management, which is part of what their expectations are for the site development. So that's could be included as part of that expectation.
It is a sensitive area at the confluence of the Schuylkill and the Delaware, and part of an estuary. Historically, the land where the refinery is, for the most part, was marshland, meadowland, and it's been filled in. Most of what's there has been landfill. A lot of Philadelphia has been landfill, and streets have been covered over, so it's not unique to the refinery.
And we appreciate that position. We are in an unfortunate position here where the refinery operated and took that land long before there were environmental regulations in place. So we're not really in a position now where we can then go back in time and make them revert to some natural conditions. It's not under our authority. We don't have the authority to do that. They own the land. We have to make sure that what we're doing is not going to impact future human health and the environment. So that was really, that's kind of the phrase catch-22 we're in right now. That is the situation we have, and there's really no ability to go back in time and change that, unfortunately. That does lead me along to what Caroline mentioned about the society aspect of what we're dealing with now. In the history, I noticed, in the discussion earlier, when anyone was there was the mention of a refinery explosion in 1968. That was before any environmental regulations were in place. So as we learn those things as a society, we step in and try to make those changes, such as the refinery. Then there were provisions put in place, which we're familiar with now with defense line monitoring. It's no longer a refinery, so there's no requirements, there's no regulations to require defense line monitoring that any further. That's part of the refinery. The situation at the refinery is now non-existent, so that expectation was under a specific Clean Air Act rule for operating refineries, which is not the case. So that is a good thing that there's not a refinery. We are working on figuring out what to do about that loss of monitoring. To answer your question specifically, Hilco will be doing actual monitoring of soil and dust while they're doing their development activities, in addition to what Dave mentioned about construction activities, common practices to wet the soil so that it doesn't create a dust situation. And the monitoring they are expected to be doing is actually, from a technical standpoint, is going to be better than defense line monitoring. Defense line monitoring that occurred was that it's an average over a couple week period. So you don't have an instantaneous result of what the actual levels of anything that's coming off the ground is. He'll be doing something more immediate samples, so they'll know right away whether or not there's anything above any standards or a concern for the community. So that's gonna be something that's a better situation than what we had in the federal. If I could, real quick, just to kind of touch on the topic, she may have now, but just on the idea of, you know, the do nothing concept. There's not been do nothing at the refinery. There's been actual, what we consider, we call them interim measures. They're actually remedial efforts that have been ongoing at the refinery for quite some time, since the early 80s. When there was acknowledgement and notification when environmental regulations first came out, there were places at the refinery where it was known that there were releases and had the potential to migrate off-site of the property. As part of what the Sunoco did at that time was they put in systems to prevent that from happening, to protect neighborhoods and to stop anything from moving. And this is specifically what our program is focused on, which is the environmental releases, something that was, you know, a material, oils, or other waste that might have been released onto the ground surface and made its way into the groundwater and had the potential to move off-site. Sunoco for years has been actually preventing that from happening. So we're moving into a phase now with the acknowledgement that we've had some, these interim measures, which are sort of stopgaps, they prevent any like off-site movement, but now we're moving into, now that we have the investigation phase of a more thorough understanding of what's at the site, we're gonna move into, they have a cleanup plan that'll be coming in, which will actually look at a broader spectrum across the site, what activities and what remedial efforts need to be done to prevent anything from further, you know, contamination and further impacts to the community.
Kevin, there are two water treatment stations, one at Point Reyes, one at Gerard Point. And under the new plan, they're being decommissioned and taken out of service, and there's going to be a new system put in place. We don't really have a good idea what the new system is.
So the new system is actually going to be two-part. One is going to be Hillco itself is going to have their own system. They have to, you know, run that through and get permits for that. That is all under regulatory programs that are in place. And then Sunoco/Evergreen will actually have a separate system that they're actually in the process of developing and designing, come up with how to run that to handle the wastewater from their treatment stations. So it's partly, there's not much information because that's sort of in flux right now. That's what I understand. It's being implemented and kind of.
That's one of the confusions for people in the community also, is that we know that there's a high level of contamination, and on a site-specific standard basis, Evergreen is going to bring it down to a level that is non-residential use, but we're concerned with maybe having something that's really safe as a playground for residential use. Hillco can bring it down further from that level to a safe level. Is there a discussion about, if not the entire property of 1,300 acres, of some sections of it that will be remediated to the point where it's at a residential level?
Not at this time that I'm aware of.
Is that something that is possible to achieve?
That is,
There's a ball
we
field.
don't have the authority to, the ball field is a one piece of one all scenario. I don't, we have to figure out what's gonna be going with that. The decision to move from a residential, to a non-residential standard to a residential standard is made by the owner of the property. So we as EK cannot go and tell them, you have to meet this standard from a residential use expectation, if they're not potentially using the property as a residential use. So, I was gonna get into another, discussion on the standards, but I think we're running over time.
Yeah, that's the key, there's a deed restriction on the property that prohibits any residential or recreational.
That's one another area of confusion, Dave, is that there was this covenant that runs through the land that Sunoco imposed when they sold it really to themselves, so they legally sold it to PBS. And that says that it has to be used for petroleum purposes forever. But it's not going to be used for those purposes. So the site-specific standards have really changed, haven't they, from petroleum to now industrial use for a logistics center, for life science center. Is Evergreen going to be remediating to the standards as a petroleum producer or as a logistics center user?
Right, they need to remediate to a non-residential use. So the cleanup they're gonna do would be appropriate for warehousing, light industrial.
The intended future use.
Exactly, but not for residential. So it couldn't be a playground, it could not be a ball field, it could not be housing.
But sections could.
The deed restriction would need to be changed, and that's not easily done at this point. And then somebody would need to step in and do a cleanup at that level.
And during the bankruptcy, Judge Gross left some issues undecided. That was one of them. There were leases that Sunoco had, and there were pipelines and other things that Sunoco had. And they had this restrictive covenant. And all of that was left to be negotiated between Sunoco and Hilco. And apparently they did. But nobody in the public knows what that is. Do you? Does the DEP know what the deal is between Sunoco and Hilco?
Well, not exactly, no. If they had a sales agreement, or some agreement between them, we don't have a copy of that. We haven't seen it. But in 2020, there was another consent order agreement that Hilco signed with Sunoco and the DEP. And so that did modify that language a little bit, that like you said previously, said future use had to remain for petroleum refining. They did alter that to be a more general non-residential use.
Well, that's good news. That's helpful.
Just wanted to respond to one of the questions earlier about flooding, stormwater, and that sort of thing. And this, we have some maps. If anyone wants to join the afternoon session, I encourage you to, because we're going to be talking more about flooding there. But if you look at some of these maps about sea level rise, just about flood, the current flood threats to this site, this region, it's a little scary looking. And if you add in storm surge and worst case scenario, sea level rise, it gets even worse. And to think about filling up the site, the lower levels of the site, and sort of fortifying this Hilco site is, and we have to question what that's going to do to the rest of Philadelphia, to other low-lying areas, neighborhoods, Eastwick, the airport, and others. The water has to go somewhere. So if the water's not going to come into be allowed into the site, so to say, it's going to be pushed elsewhere. So I think, I think the council encourages flexibility, creativity, and imagination in thinking about how this site can be cleaned up, the future development of it. And we can't, looking at all the water and the runoff, we can't think that paving it all over in asphalt is going to help us very much. I know there's some technical, legal hurdles that would have to be, jumped, but I hope that we can encourage Hilco as a new owner to go above and beyond what Evergreen or Sunoco, the subsidiary of Sunoco is responsible for cleaning up. Because they could, in theory, technically, try to go further, right? They could spend money to clean it up more, to look at how can the public actually have access to the riverfront for once, in generations, to green space that the communities deserve after having been burdened for over a century and a half by the former refinery. So this is, we need to feed, and we need to encourage flexibility and creativity as much as possible from everyone involved.
That was about the flooding, so that was.
The flooding, yeah. There's so flood maps are a part of this package to show what will happen with just the sea level rise. But stormwater, some of the intense storms that we have, without retention, although the impervious surfaces that have been in the refinery in the past, and what is planned for it now with these big warehouses, we have a serious problem in terms of water runoff causing additional flooding. And as Matt said, the river pinches right there at the lower Schuylkill, and because it's all bulkheaded, and fortified, and now they're gonna raise the land. That water will back up into Logan Square in Center City, and it will exacerbate the problems that we have in Eastwick and the airport and all the other water. I thank everybody for coming. I've been told that our time is up now.